the majesty of our planet's landscape. From vast flatlands and oceans to the craggy peaks of the highest mountains, we are defined more by our natural surroundings than we're often aware. There are forces lurking beneath the Earth's crust, forces powerful enough to shape our landscape, alter the Earth's natural weather patterns, and snuff out entire civilizations in a heartbeat. The island of Martinique in the Caribbean was settled in 1635 by the French explorer Ansembuc, who quickly established the city of Saint-Pierre. Over the next 100 years, Saint-Pierre would become the hub of Martinique's island economy.
This quarter of Fort Saint-Pierre is an agricultural district, a fertile area, with large plantations, large agricultural activities. And parallel to this quarter would also be the mouillage quarter, more to the south. The mouillage quarter is linked in effect to the boats that came to supply the colony with provisions, because not everything was cultivated or produced on site.
Dubbed the Paris of the Caribbean, the community of almost 30,000 matures into a cultural center for the island.
There were buildings, hotels, the theater of Saint-Pierre, which was very reputable. The theater received companies from all over Europe. The metropolitans that arrived could hear opera songs being sung out in the street. It was the fashion, too. I remember the fashion. People were well dressed. People read. There was culture.
Marking the Martinique skyline are the majestic peaks of Mont Pelee, which stand nearly 1,400 meters above sea level. Housing what was once an active volcano, Pelée had not seen any activity in decades. But by the late 1800s, Mont Pelee begins to show signs of waking. By 1902, sulfurous gas emissions from Pelée become more frequent and are noticed in the city of Saint-Pierre.
The first warning signs were visible as of 1882, with the clouds of sulfuric gases appearing at the summit of the volcano, and more importantly, the sulfur smells, which were very noticeable to the north of Saint-Pierre in the commune of Précheur.
But for many, Pelée's renewed activity is little more than a conversation piece.
L'éruption qui avait eu lieu précédemment était au milieu du 19e siècle.
The previous eruption occurred in the middle of the 19th century, but people didn't really have a really horrible memory of it. They remembered it more as a beautiful show. They weren't attacked, destroyed, so they didn't imagine it to be what it was.
For others, like the Gauguin family, the sulfurous emissions prove no more than a minor annoyance as they go about their daily regimen. Louis-Auguste Cyprius concentrates on keeping out of sight. He is at large after escaping from the Martinique jail a few days before. 1 month later, Pelée spurts a cloud of ash into the atmosphere.
Smoke rolls appeared at the summit of the volcano, and we saw the appearance of ash emissions, of vapors, and after that an eruption, a vaporous eruption that descended into the atmosphere.
There's a number of precursor events which could lead up to an eruption. Before the magma rises to the surface, it actually brecciates and fractures the rock underground there, so we see a swarm of little micro-earthquakes and tremors. So if you're actually on the volcano, you'd feel the ground shaking.
As spectators marvel at the geological oddity before them, they have no inkling of the forces that have been set in motion miles beneath the surface. Ash showers become so constant, carriage wheels are muffled by the bed of fallen cinders that cover the street. Tremors become steadily more violent.
Small eruptions can be taken as a precursor to a large eruption. As the magma sort of rises to the surface, it does so in pulses. So if you have one eruption, it's very likely you're going to have 2 or 3 more.
The first wave of panic ripples through the population. Some leave their homes for other islands. Yet many are still convinced that the increased volcanic activity will soon subside, such as shoemaker Léon Compère Léandre, who is more concerned with filling his backlog of orders. Residents are encouraged by the comparative quiet of May 4th, among them the Gauguin family, who takes the opportunity to enjoy the reprieve. In the nearby town of Corbeil, the Soulange family also breathes a sigh of relief, even though their youngest child, Michel, seems to be falling ill. For nearly 3 decades, the Gorin-Oussine sugar refinery has been a cornerstone of Saint-Pierre's industry. The owner and his 25 employees arrive for work amidst the now familiar rumblings of the volcano. Others are not so easily assured. Having closely observed the volcanic developments of Mont Pelee since its awakening, natural sciences professor Landé notices a strange phenomenon playing out in the Rivière Blanche near the summit.
At Mount Pelée, there was a crater lake filled with water, and as the volcano started to heat up and become more active, this lake started to boil, and eventually the actual edges of the lake collapsed, releasing a torrent of this water down into the local river system, which swelled sort of 4 or 5 times its normal size. It carried boulders, ash and material, producing a huge mudflow, which we call a lahar.
Several thousand cubic tons of mud spew from the side of the mountain, descending into Saint-Pierre at breakneck speed, decimating everything in its path.
The people would have seen a wall of mud coming down the mountain at extremely fast speeds, and the noise would have been a loud roaring noise.
Directly in the mudflow's path is the Gorin-Oussine sugar refinery. It is instantaneously consumed, killing all 25 employees. That same day, Martinique Governor Moutet calls for an immediate inquiry into the mudslide, resulting in the formation of a scientific panel of experts. Professor Landé is among them.
Cette commission s'est réunie et n'ont pas trouvé cette dangerosité.
This commission met, but they did not find any danger. They thought that if they had an eruption with lava, that the valleys that surrounded the city would act as a barrier for the town.
Professor Landé's report garners the full endorsement of the governor, who finds a receptive audience as he encourages residents to stay in Saint-Pierre.
There were people from the surrounding area of Carbes, of Préchour, of Mont Rouge, who felt safer in the city of Saint-Pierre, who came to seek shelter in Saint-Pierre. So simply, this city, built of stone, gave a feeling of being more solid and more protective.
Les Pierrotains ne voulaient pas s'éloigner de leurs affaires. Il y avait des commerçants,
Pierrotins did not want to leave their affairs behind. There were merchants, there were riches, and there were possessions that the people did not want to abandon without knowing how they would be protected. These are the reasons why some people stayed.
Yet some question if the governor's motivations are purely in the interests of public safety.
I should add another explanation, that the second round of the legislative elections were set to take place on Sunday, so people had to stay where they were to vote. Governor Boutet asked people to stay where they were in order to go to the polls.
Questions also arise regarding the validity of the scientific report. Rumors abound that Landé has bowed to political pressure from the governor.
Il s'est inquiété quand même.
He became anxious, and it is said that he should have warned the authorities so that we could have evacuated the city. But it was never done, always for those famous political reasons.
An editorial published in the local paper openly mocks those choosing to flee Saint-Pierre, further conflicting those who are undecided.
It was also a religious holiday because it was Ascension Thursday, Therefore, a lot of Pierrotins had reason to stay. Also, many had evacuated their families but remained behind themselves for professional reasons.
Dans la nuit donc du 7 au 8
On the night of the 8th of May, there was a terrible rain, torrential rain, with the emanations of ash, black ash, which obscured the summit and the town, which really scared the population.
Et au sommet du volcan, des éclairs et le tonnerre qui effrayaient, si on peut dire, la population.
The Devold family and their boarder Léon Compère Léon watch the spewings of Mont Pelee from their home until they are driven elsewhere. Seeking shelter, Louis-Auguste Cyprius voluntarily turns himself into police that evening. As night falls on May 8, 1902, close to 30,000 people are in Saint-Pierre, and Mont Pelee prepares to alter their lives forever. Daylight breaks on Martinique on the 8th of May to reveal a decimated landscape. The once lush lands at the foot of Mont Pelee have turned a lifeless gray, beaten down by the relentless ash and volcanic shrapnel. Water continues rushing through the Rivière Blanche at an alarming rate, described as hitting the sea with freight train velocity. Yet Pelee itself shows little indication of any volcanic activity. The violent tremblings of the previous night have subsided. A few kilometers to the south of Saint-Pierre, merchant Charles Gauguin and his son Henri head for the harbor to pick up a shipment due to arrive that morning. They leave behind Charles' two daughters, Elise and Jeanne. The Soulange family prepares to attend Ascension Day services, but Michel is too sick to accompany them.
All of my mother's relatives had gone to Mass. They didn't live too far from the church, only 200 meters or so. They had gone to Mass, and she had a bout of bronchitis, so she didn't go. She was confined to the house.
In an effort to convince citizens that Mont Pelee is not dangerous, Governor Moutet, along with his wife and Secretary of State, make an excursion to the summit for a personal inspection. At a few minutes before 8 o'clock, it happens without warning.
La première démolition a eu lieu, si on peut dire, par l'onde de choc.
The first demolition took place by a shockwave, which destroyed homes. Homes fell in on their inhabitants.
Donc les pierres sont tombées sur les habitants en premier lieu.
A burning cloud of ash and gas, known as a nuée ardente, descends on the town at 500 kilometers an hour.
This hurricane force wind which poured down the side of the volcano with this massive flow of gas, supercharged gas, very hot, very fast flowing with rock and ash particles, and this would have just raced down the side of the volcano, accelerating with gravity down the steep slopes until they hit the town of Saint-Pierre some 2 seconds later.
The nuée ardente rips through Saint-Pierre, its blinding heat consuming everything in its path.
Saint-Pierre had been completely pulverized, carbonized, blown away in one moment. In 5 minutes, the city was destroyed by the fiery ash cloud. If you look at the documents, you will see that the speed of the fiery ash cloud prevented practically all escape.
Miraculously, those in communities surrounding Saint-Pierre are spared from the deadly cloud.
The death cloud didn't overcome the hills that are between Saint-Pierre and Colbert, but it was able to follow the length of the valleys and the ocean border. The death cloud extended all the way to Colbert River.
As the Gauguin sisters try to comprehend what has happened, a painful realization sinks in.
They had nothing left. They were totally orphaned. Fortunately, they had an uncle who was a pharmacist and who didn't have any children and who was able to take them in.
In a matter of minutes, the city of Saint-Pierre and its nearly 30,000 inhabitants are swept into oblivion. Among them, Governor Moutet and his wife, who are killed halfway up the summit. In addition to the gas cloud, the percussion of the eruption produces a tidal wave over 100 feet high that decimates the island of Martinique.
Carbet was entirely destroyed by this tidal wave. Those that arrived after saw that there was no one left in the town because everyone ran towards the highest hills.
With the tidal wave having destroyed many of the boats on Martinique, vessels are dispatched from surrounding islands to aid survivors.
Certain people brought nothing with them but their jewelry. There was one lady who had a basket of jewelry, but when she arrived on the beach, they said, "You aren't bringing anything. You can only bring yourself." So these people felt bad to have to get rid of this basket of jewelry.
For many, the beach is a gathering point where family members are reunited, among them the Soulange family.
It was a neighbor that got my mother out, and she rejoined her parents on the height of the exodus. She said, "I only had my little porcelain doll that I pressed against my heart." My mother was only 8 years old then, so she was only a little girl and had lots of emotions.
The Gauguin sisters also arrive at the beach, but not before encountering several horrifying sights along their way.
They tried to go to Font Saint-Denis, but they weren't able to cross the river, so they went back to Enfantin. Enfantin was full of injured people, of burnt people who were laying down on banana leaves. Their flesh would stick to your hand if you tried to move them.
The autopsies that were performed showed that the people died essentially from internal burns because they inhaled these extremely hot gases.
Amazingly, a survivor is found in the heart of Saint-Pierre.
Les murs font près d'1 mètre d'épaisseur et avec peu d'ouvertures.
The walls were nearly 1 meter thick, with very few openings. So when the New Ardent passed over, some heat got into the cell. But he was not killed. He was burned some, and it wasn't until 3 days after the catastrophe he was found by rescuers. Cyprus attained world celebrity. He joined with Barnum & Bailey's circus and was able to do a world tour to exhibit his wounds and tell the tale of the catastrophe.
Shoemaker Léon Compère Léon, by some miracle, is also found alive in his house. He and Cyprius are all that remain of the population of Saint-Pierre. With its population wiped out, the city of Saint-Pierre falls into relative obscurity.
Saint-Pierre was a no man's land from 1902 to 1912. There was no more vegetation. People were afraid to come to Saint-Pierre because the volcanic phenomenon really touched the lives of the population. People came to Saint-Pierre to see what was left, the ruins of the catastrophe, and it wasn't really until 1917 that the economic life really came back.
Fort-de-France becomes the center of commerce for the island of Martinique. Despite a resettling of the area, Saint-Pierre never reaches its former population of 30,000.
Today, Saint-Pierre is a small community. It has at most 5,000 people, whereas the population was close to 30,000 people on the eve of the eruption.
The volcano has erupted twice since 1902, once in August of that year and again in 1929. But the extreme violence of the May 8, 1902 eruption has earned it the title of the worst volcanic disaster of the 20th century. The memory of those lost souls from 1902 are embodied in a statue which lies in the resurrected town square.
Elle symbolise en fait Saint-Pierre renaissante.
She is a symbol of Saint Pierre being reborn. She was offered to the town of Saint Pierre in 1928 to mark the rebirth of the town.
To ensure the tragedy of May 8, 1902 is never repeated, a volcano observation station is set up to monitor potential activity on Mont Pelee. In addition, an escape plan has been devised in the event that Pelee erupts again.
Right now, the school curriculum is teaching the risks of volcanoes and seismics, so the population is informed.
Despite the 100 years that have passed since that cataclysmic eruption, Mount Pelee's terrifying legacy still lives on.
There are still people who have never set foot on Saint Pierre because they are afraid of the volcano. My mother is terrified of the idea of spending a couple of days in Saint Pierre, sleeping in the eye of the volcano.
Vous n'allez pas me faire grimper sur la montagne Pelée. Il y avait aussi.
You won't get me to climb Mount Pelee. At the museum, there is a telescope that lets you look closely at the volcano. But I never dared to look at Pelee up close. I am too afraid to.
In the South Pacific lies a rim of volcanoes known as the Pacific Ring of Fire. This area is more susceptible to volcanic activity than any other area in the world. On New Zealand's northern island, the Ring of Fire is represented by Mount Ruapehu. Standing over 9,000 feet high, the mountain is the highest point on the island and houses an active volcano.
Mount Ruapehu is a very active volcano. It's one of the most active volcanoes in New Zealand. It's one of the more active volcanoes in the world.
Ruapehu is a very rugged mountain, like all mountains. It's cold, a rugged landscape, full of rocks, boulders, ash from past eruptions. The nice clean winter snow comes, covers it all up.
At the summit of Mount Ruapehu lies the majestic and aptly named Crater Lake.
Crater Lake occupies the active crater of Ruapehu. It's in a depression, a basin. Usually it's filled with water, and the water comes from melting snow and ice, and it basically reaches a level and overflows over the lowest part of the crater rim and forms the head of the Whangaehu River.
The mountain is a popular recreation spot for skiers and hikers, drawn to the mountain by its rugged beauty.
You could actually swim in the Crater Lake. It was quite the thing for young people to climb the mountain and dip into the Crater Lake. You were very careful what you wore because it was sulfuric acid. If you wore nylon things, they didn't last, and you might go in with the nylon togs and you didn't come out with them.
In 1945, Mount Ruapehu is in eruption over several months, sending lava and a mixture of sediment and water known as lahars down the mountain and into the Whangaehu River.
Lahar is an Indonesian word for volcanic mudflow. Basically a flood, a little bit like a concrete slurry. Very sediment-laden water with carrying boulders up to maybe a metre or so.
Eventually, the crater lake is emptied out. Ash from the eruptions settles to create an elevated bank around Crater Lake. Meltwater and rain slowly refill the empty crater over the next several years. By 1953, the lake rises to 8 meters above its previous level. The ash bank is reinforced by the Whangaehu Glacier, which helps to support the pressure of the additional water. In the rural communities of Tangiwai and Karioi, flanking either side of the Whangaehu River, Ruapehu's last eruption is at best a distant memory. Residents in the area go about their daily business as they always have.
It was a sheep and cattle farming area. Ohakuni was then and always has been a market gardening town.
Not many people even owned a car here at that time. No tar-sealed roads. It was all just metal roads. Generally, it was probably still a good life with a good community.
Horses were the main method of getting around, and still are for most of our farm work. In those days, the mail used to come twice a week, so we didn't have a great deal of contact with the outside world, really.
With the coming of summer, the ice on the Mount Ruapehu Glacier begins to melt. As the glacier recedes, the ash wall holding back 70 million cubic feet of water begins to weaken. December 24th, 1953. Christmas thoughts abound as New Zealanders find themselves caught up in the last-minute details of the season. In addition to the usual holiday festivities, Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh make a stop in New Zealand on a leg of their 1953 World Tour. As night falls in the rural areas near the Whangaehu River, many people are taking care of last-minute details, such as local farmer Ian Strawn.
That Christmas Eve, first thing that my wife said to me was, "Did you get a Christmas tree?" I had completely forgotten about it, so I said, "I know exactly where there is one." I went down to our original road bridge. There was a tree growing right on the end of the bridge, so I cut that down.
Local volunteer ambulance driver George Murdy is still at his day job in the Owakuni grocery store.
I worked in grocery shop, and I did that, and we'd done 14 hours on our feet that day.
Just west of Owakuni, in the town of Ruapehu, Cyril Ellis, his wife and mother-in-law, are en route from their home in Taihape to Cyril's parents' home near Owakuni. That evening, the express train from Wellington chugs its way to Auckland, 409 miles to the north. Among the passengers on board are Beverly Mahi and her younger brother John, on their way home to meet their parents for Christmas.
We did have first-class tickets, but we could not have a seat because they were totally booked. So we were put in the second carriage from the engine, which was a second-class carriage.
The two are assured by train guard Ian Inglis that every effort will be made to rectify their situation. Ann Kennedy and her sister Helen get a first-class seat. They are on their way home to the family farm near Owakuni. The driver of the express is Charles Parker. After arranging to swap shifts with a colleague, he is told at the last minute by his employers that he must adhere to the original duty roster. Also making the trip are Ann Pallison and her fiancé Thomas Moyer.
And I was working that day and catching the train just after 6, I think it came through Palmerston, and Thomas had got on the train in Levin. And so we had a happy time together on the train.
As George Murdy arrives home after his 14-hour shift at the grocery store, a puzzling activity is noted at the Chateau Tongariro, a few miles away from Mount Ruapehu.
At 8 o'clock, vibrations were picked up on the seismograph at the chateau. At the time, there wasn't really an earthquake recorded. It was one of those graph wheels that just showed a needle popped up.
The ash bank surrounding Crater Lake has collapsed. As water begins channeling beneath the summer-weakened glacier, a large section of it caves in. Thousands of tons of water and ice roar down the mountainside, picking up massive amounts of debris and glacier till, and creating a lahar that surges into the Whangaehu River. The lahar destroys everything in its path, including the piers of the railway bridge across which the coming express train must pass.
Pier 4 went first, followed by Pier 5 on the bridge. Broke number 4 pier into 3, and the bottom piece of that pier weighed 126 tons solid concrete, and that was carried some 100 yards downstream.
South of the river, the express train stops in Waiuru before unwittingly steaming towards the chasm that is opened up over the now raging Whangaehu River. The Wellington to Auckland Express continues steaming towards the Whangaehu River, oblivious to the fact that the railway bridge has been washed away.
They're solid bridge piers which weighed over 126 tonnes, carried hundreds of yards down the river, and some of those chunks of concrete have never been found.
Luckily for Bev and John Mahi, guard Inglis finally manages to locate a pair of first-class seats at the back of the train.
Consequently, he came through in Hunterville and said, well, there's a couple of first-class seats up in the back carriage. So consequently, we were changed at Hunterville from second-class to first-class seats, which of course was the last carriage at the back of the train.
At 10:15 p.m., Cyril Ellis arrives at the Whangaehu Road Bridge.
Come to the road bridge, saw a road bridge washed away, got out to investigate. And just as he did that, he heard and just looked behind and saw a big bright light about a mile down the railway line. So he went running back to stop that light, and as he got back, he realised it was a train.
Ellis quickly grabs a flashlight from his vehicle and sprints towards the rail tracks in an effort to stop the train before it goes over the bridge.
Obviously the driver, Mr. Parker, very experienced driver, did see the torch. And as the train sped on, the emergency brakes were applied.
But despite the efforts of Ellis and Parker, the train is not able to stop in time.
And within 6 seconds, the Wellington to Auckland Express went roaring across a sagging bridge, railway bridge just north of Tangiwai, and plunged into the Whangaehu River.
All 5 second-class cars plummet into the river, taking 176 passengers with them.
The carriage just right up over top of the rubber motor. The train did a jump 40 yards across the other side of the bank, and the 5 second-class carriages on the train went into the river.
The car immediately behind the engine is miraculously thrown clear of the rushing torrent. Those in carriages 2 through 5 are not so fortunate. Anne Pallison is suddenly jarred from her sleep.
Next thing I knew, there was this roaring, rushing sound, and I actually came to under the water. And this other girl, she'd been travelling with her sister, and she, thinking I was her sister, had grabbed me by the hair, and she'd pulled me up.
The 2 women manage to climb on top of the train car as it sinks into the Whangaehu River.
Whether I would have survived if this girl hadn't pulled me up, it's one of those things you don't know. And I was looking for Thomas, and it was just a rush of water. And
Up above, the 6th passenger car teeters on the remnants of the south side of the bridge, still connected to the remaining 5 cars. Cyril Ellis boards the rear car of the train, where he runs into guard William Ian Inglis.
Mr. Inglis was in disbelief, so both of them just got onto the train and went running down through that first-class carriage, and they peered out into the roaring torrent. He said, oh God, I've lost an engine and 5 carriages in the river.
Word of the dangling carriage filters back through the train. Fearing that other cars may also slip into the river, the passengers on the remaining 5 cars are evacuated.
And it wasn't until some minutes later when the guard came through and said that the train had gone over the bridge. So of course we all got out, and once you got out of the carriage you could hear the noise of the river and the screams of the people and that sort of thing.
Moments after Ellis's arrival, the 6th car tumbles into the river 50 feet below. Word of the disaster spreads quickly throughout Tangiwai and surrounding area. Volunteer ambulance driver George Murdy is among the first to be called.
There was banging on our bedroom window, and it was my brother. And he said, George, quick, there's been an accident with the express at Tangiwai, you're wanted.
And we spoke to a woman from Ruapehu who was trying to get hold of her daughter that lived in Tangiwai. And she said, the express is in the river there at Tangiwai. It was breaking day, so we hopped in our truck and we went upstream.
Miraculously, no one on the 6th car is seriously injured by the impact of the fall. Ellis and Inglis quickly break open windows and assist other passengers onto the roof of the carriage.
They have their torches, and they got the people down the carriages, down the end of the carriage, broke some windows, and actually pulled the people clear out of the carriage because it was up over their armpits.
Ann Kennedy is the only person to perish in car 6, trapped under a seat from the impact.
The girl that was drowned in that carriage, from all accounts, was crushed by the weight of the luggage that fell onto her down the far end of the carriage, and she was under the water for too long.
Many of the passengers aboard cars 2 through 5 are washed into the river and swept away by the lahar, never to be seen again. Of the 176 passengers aboard the 5 carriages that fall into the river, only 28 survive. 20 others are never found. Among them, engine driver Charles Parker and fireman Lance Redman. Also lost is Thomas Moyer.
They never actually found Thomas. Search went on for days, and his parents were here in Levin, but they went up to Whangaehu, to the army camp. They had a morgue set up there for people to come and try and identify people. But he was never ever found. Just a special person, of course, to me. But and as I say, he was the only child, his mother's only child.
Ann Pallison emerges from the wreckage unscathed. Ann and the woman who saved her are the only 2 survivors of car 3.
When the express didn't arrive and the word came through that what had happened, they immediately drove out there, so they were soon there. And there was quite a few people milling around there at the time.
Thomas Kennedy and his older brother Jim are among those arriving on the scene from Owakuni. They cannot know that their sister Ann is already among the dead.
The news must have gone around and quite a few people were going out to have a look-see. And got out there and had to stop quite a bit short of where the road bridge was because it had gone as well.
Slowly, the lahar begins to subside, causing the river's water level to drop enough to allow those trapped on the roof of the 6th car to reach the shore.
The local community was great. Hundreds of volunteers all streamed off to the Tangiwai disaster area, tried to help to get the survivors out. It was a great community effort to save any survivors.
By the time many of the locals arrive, however, those who can be saved already have been. Local area farmer David Berry and his father are shocked by what they see.
This horrific scene just opened up before us, and it was just unbelievable. There was mud everywhere. You could make out the forms of what was left of carriages. There wasn't a great lot you could do really at that stage, because any body that was going to be rescued from the immediate area had already been rescued, and that was only very, very few.
All that remains is the gruesome task of recovering bodies along the banks of the river.
First thing, of course, I saw was a body lying on the sand, so I thought, well, the best thing to do now was to take my wife and daughter home and come back. There was quite a few on the other side of the river, and any bodies that were on this side, they would throw me a rope over, and I would tie the body to the rope, and then they would have to pull the body back through the river.
I signalled to him he was going to tie it around the shoulders, which we would have lost the body in the river. And I said, no, ground feet. So we got that one out.
The first light of Christmas Day 1953 breaks, slowly revealing a horrific scene along the banks of the Whangaehu River.
I think the saddest part that stood out in my mind was the amount of children's toys and things like that were washed up on little backwashes and things like that. I presume people were taking presents home for Christmas and things like that, and I think that was what sort of hurt you most.
New Zealanders wake to the tragic news as word of the accident is broadcast across the country.
We were expecting to hear stories about the Queen and the Duke going to communion or something like that, instead of which there was sad music and said there had been a tragedy.
Survivors are loaded back onto another train heading for Hamilton, where relatives are instructed to meet them.
I got asked to send a telegram, and we were asked to send a telegram with not too much on it. So all I put on the telegram was, "We are all right, Bev."
The hunt for victims continues for days around the Whangaehu River. In the end, the final death toll will reach 151. 20 bodies are never recovered.
They even put nets out across the mouth along the river, out by the sea, to catch bodies floating down. And they're all taken to New Zealand Army camp at Whangaehu, where they were all lined up and identified.
Well, and Jim hitched a ride to Whangaehu Army camp, and that's when he found that Helen was safe and Anne was dead.
Queen Elizabeth addresses the tragedy in her annual Christmas speech, which is beamed around the world. An inquiry into the disaster is launched.
The Board of Inquiry, with Judge Stilwell, said that no one was to blame. It was a chain of events that happened and couldn't be stopped.
For his bravery, Cyril Ellis receives the George Medal, and for his part, William Ian Inglis receives the Empire Medal. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh also take time to meet with victims and families to personally pass on their condolences during a memorial service in Wellington.
It was the world's 6th largest railway disaster, New Zealand's biggest.
3 months later, a new bridge is constructed across the Whangaehu River. Engineers designed this one to withstand the force of another lahar.
Was built a much stronger design with piers that were obviously made of concrete.
Warning systems are also put in place to safeguard against potential lahar activity.
It gives sufficient time for the rail authorities to stop rail traffic.
No subsequent eruption has caused the same damage or loss of life as the one that struck in 1953. But it is a mathematical certainty that another lahar of its magnitude will happen again.
There's one that's quite likely to happen in the next year or two as a result of the 1995 eruption. We expect that lahar to happen sometime in late in 2002 or the 2002-03 summer or later, depending on how fast the last part of the lake fills up.
Yet for some, the images of that night in 1953 will remain permanently etched in their memories.
I've been very much affected by the Tangiwai disaster myself. It gives you a far wider view of what life may or may not be. You know, none of us know when we're going to go. It's just the flick of a providence.
Of course, I couldn't have the life that I thought I was going to have, but you make of life what you've got, don't you? What you can.
Two different tragedies, two different eras, yet both with tragic results. The eruptions of these two volcanoes are important reminders to the human race that we are but a fleeting moment in geological time.